Hi. Actually, the reason I'm here is because we couldn't do anything like this in New Mexico because there are no schedules available from our governor. And I'm not the State House reporter, but I kind of got involved in this when I moved to New Mexico about a year ago. I oversee the state. And the first thing that struck me was our new governor, who touts herself as the transparency governor. That's one of her big items on her website, the transparency governor. Very rarely gave any kind of advance notice about even public appearances. We get a notice like 2 hours in advance that she's going to have a press conference. So, half the time you can't even get there. So I started talking with the State House reporter, and he'd been wrestling with trying to get schedules and whatnot. But traditionally in New Mexico, I don't think the governors have ever really provided, not in recent years, any kind of detailed schedules. So I went ahead and did a FOIA or IPRA, whatever we want to call it, for her schedules. And it took the full 15 days. This was after she went out and was talking about her great transparency in response to public records requests. And what she sent back to me after the full 15 days was a copy of the public appearances on her website, and completely ignored the other part of my request for all of her travel and her work schedules. In fact, they never responded to that at all. And in my conversations with her office, kind of off the record, but they wouldn't respond officially, I was basically told that she doesn't keep any calendars. I was like, well, how does she do her expense report? so that, and when as I was doing a story about this for the New Mexico Wire, one of the State House reporters had told me that another State House reporter had done a survey, an informal survey of other Capitol correspondents around the country, just asking how many governors gave out advance schedules. And she sent me all of her information because she had never used it. She was using it just to get some leverage with her governor to try to get more information about her schedule. And I think it showed that 35 of the State House correspondents responded. And of those, only 4 of those governors gave comprehensive schedules, like a schedule that shows public, I'm doing a press conference today, then I'm going to meet with legislative leaders, and there's a closed meeting, and that was my experience in the past. I've covered several state houses or overseen coverage of them over the years. And I think I remember most in Texas. We kind of got a general calendar every week, every day, kind of this is what he's doing, this is who he's meeting with. And he didn't always say who he was meeting with, but you got a general sense. And that was kind of, and I got the impression in talking to some other State House reporters that over the years that practice has kind of eroded. And, we don't know what a lot of these, New Mexico is not the only state where governors have refused after the fact to release their calendars. It's like, it's a little disturbing, and it's a little disturbing too that we're letting them get away with it. I mean, my boss has to know what I'm doing. I don't understand why they don't have to tell the taxpayers what they're doing.
Peter, tell us how in California you didn't let them get away with it.
I'd be happy to. Can people hear me? Well, California is has sort of an interesting saga here because since the very early 1990s, 1991 actually, in 1991, the California Supreme Court, in a complicated decision which has been haunting access advocates for years, basically ruled against the Los Angeles Times. The Los Angeles Times was using our FOIA law to try to get access to then Governor Deukmejian's calendars, schedules, for multiple years in the late 1980s. And while it was a complicated, rather nuanced decision, it was understood to mean that under no circumstances could the press or the public demand and get access to that information. And that was the way things stood through 4 or 5 governors after that. Schwarzenegger was elected, calling himself the open government governator. And just as he was elected in California, we also, the voters had also just then passed a state constitutional amendment, an open sunshine amendment. And one of the things that drafters and supporters of that amendment thought it had done was, in a subtle way, a not so clear way, overruled the bad old California Supreme Court decision from 1991. And so we immediately, after passage of that constitutional amendment, my organization immediately sued Governor Schwarzenegger, who had then been in an office a year and a half. And we were expecting a long, drawn-out battle, and but to our surprise, he sort of outmaneuvered his opposition by standing up and saying, well, you know, my lawyers are telling me I can't, I'm out of my mind here, but I don't really care if the people get to see my calendar. So sure, I haven't really figured out how we'll do this, but I want to put it out there, and I will do so very soon. And so a couple of days later, after negotiations between my office and his lawyers, we did receive this huge dump of calendars from a variety of different sources covering his first year in office, which was also his most active and perhaps his most effective and successful year as governor. That was rich with information. And there were a number of very interesting stories, although he did withhold lots of stuff. He characterized things as personal, but what he really meant by personal was they were political, and what he meant by political was it's none of your goddamn business. And that covered a lot of stuff, but nonetheless what was in there provided useful information for a number of reporters to do some very smart stories about comparing the degree of access of various special interest groups in the state to the governor, as evidenced by how much time he sat beside them sharing a cigar. And that information previously was not available. Well, interestingly, after that, so he pledged also to continue to make these calendars available on a monthly basis. So at the end of every month, you would get the calendar for that month just completed. Immediately, Sacramento reporters who had been following this could see a dramatic difference in the degree of detail being provided. The first set of documents, the first set of calendars, were, as I say, loaded with stuff. Why? Because when they were being maintained throughout that year by the governor, by his secretary, by his aides who could place things on that calendar, they had no clue, they had no expectation that it would ever see the light of day. You tend to get a lot more candid information from government officials when they are writing something or saying something in a context where they have confidence, a high degree of confidence that no one will ever hear about it. And so the retrospective set of schedules and calendars was quite interesting and useful. The prospective, or the new stuff written under circumstances where everybody putting something on the calendar knew it would be viewed 30 days hence by the press, was a much less candid document. In any event, he continued to disclose on that basis. So our court case didn't go forward because we had gotten all the relief we specifically were asking for. We tried to still test this issue in other ways by suing his aides and to get their calendars, to see things that were on their calendar involving the governor that were not on the governor's calendars. But they gave us those calendars too, mooting out that case. In a variety of other ways, we tried it, and ultimately we're not able to get the legal question resolved about whether this constitutional amendment had indeed changed the law in California so that one now had a legal right to this stuff. But during the 4, I guess it was, years of his governorship, as a practical matter, the political reality on the street had changed. If the governor and his aides were going to make public their calendars, well then of course all the statewide officers, from the Attorney General to Lieutenant Governor and so forth, they couldn't say otherwise, particularly since they were both political opponents of Governor Schwarzenegger. And then it started to trickle down because all the media were aware of this, and they started making demands on mayors and school superintendents, etc. And one would be hard pressed as a mayor of Valencia in California, population 50,000, to be able to say, well, I know the governor has decided to give you his stuff, but I'm so important that I have to invoke the deliberative process and executive privilege and deny the same information to you. No, that was politically rather difficult for them to say. So it became one of these things, kind of like presidential candidates have to release their tax returns. Needless to say, there's nothing in the law that says that the press has a right of access to their tax returns or anybody else's federal tax returns. But it's political suicide not to release them. And in much the same way, the political culture had changed, so people did have access to them. But now, fast forward to the present, our new governor, Jerry Brown, who was Attorney General during this time and was forced to release his calendars then for political reasons, is now taking a different view. His office is not currently releasing calendars, and no one really has bothered to challenge him on it, and I think in part that's because the expectation is what you would get would not be very insightful from a journalistic standpoint.
Thank you. Matt, with regard to the landscape in Arkansas, how much of the information in Governor Beebe's calendars sees the light of day?
It's, as you might imagine, somewhere in between Wisconsin and New Mexico. Arkansas generally has a pretty strong Freedom of Information Act. There is, though, what's been a very broadly interpreted exemption for the governor's office. So we're not required to disclose anything, but we do put out the governor's public schedule, both for any events that we're doing, of course, it's for our own good, and for any public events he's traveling to or speaking to as well. And we also make note anytime the governor's traveling out of state, because, of course, we have chain of command, lieutenant governor takes over, and in Arkansas's history that has been an area rife with concern. So we make sure to let people know when that goes out as well. As far as his travel goes, most of the requests we get for that, there's a state police plane that we have first call on and we use to travel around the state. Those records are obtainable through the state police, but they give no description of the reason for the trip. So I maintain a database, and at the governor's request, and whenever it's asked for, I turn it over to anyone saying, this is why we took this trip, this is why we took this trip, this is what we did. Because again, the immediate previous governor made a lot of news for using this taxpayer-funded airplane to do a lot of political travel. And so when Governor Beebe took office, he pledged he would not do that. And so he said one of the things that he would do to prove it is, turn over the records and detail out for them, create the record of everywhere that we went. Plus, it helps that I do work for a governor who does not create a lot of suspicion among our Capitol press corps, because he's very accessible, to my chagrin often, but he will, if someone calls me saying, hey, we need a reaction from the governor on this issue that has come up, I will say, okay, we're coming back from this lunch event at 12:30, meet us at the front door. And that's the entirety of the planning that goes into that, that media interview. Also, the governor's parking space at the Capitol is directly outside the window of the Capitol Press Bureau. So they know, regardless of what I say, they know if he is there or not. So that helps, that helps shine some light there whether or not anyone wants it to. But generally, in Arkansas, we don't necessarily get the requests because there's not that inherent just butting of heads all the time. And frankly, if it came to that and lawsuits arose, I don't know how they'd go, but that has not been an issue for us. Regarding
Governor's schedules, how important are they ultimately?
I mean, especially in like New Mexico, we've got a governor who is considered a finalist for vice presidential, not Republican. She's the first Hispanic Latina governor, female Latina governor. She's considered on the short list, for vice presidential nomination, and we have no idea what she's doing. I mean, I know when she has a press conference, and that's it. She's not accessible. She's not. It's not like you can go catch her somewhere. We have no idea when she travels out of state. That's her father lives in El Paso, and I think she goes there quite often because she has a disabled sister. But she wants to change the law so that she doesn't have to cede power when she leaves the state. But she doesn't tell the lieutenant governor when she leaves the state. So I mean, there's so many things going on that, we have no idea when she's in the state, when she's not in the state. I don't know how much time she's spending with the RNC promoting herself as a vice presidential candidate, and how much time she's doing taxpayer business. I mean, I have no idea what she's doing. So.
Well, I think in that circumstance, you definitely need to know those things. I mean, I think the public is entitled to know when the governor is out of the state, and therefore in many states constitutionally disabled from exercising many of the powers of the office, if nothing more. You know, people, even an incomplete calendar, which, as I was saying before, is what you inevitably get once the rules of the game change and everybody knows that the calendar is going to eventually become public. Even an incomplete calendar is still worthwhile, by which I mean not just valuable to journalists for what they do, but it provides information that citizens, that voters are entitled to have. I think citizens are entitled to know just roughly, you know, how many hours of the week is the governor working for us versus how many hours of the week he's working for himself, or he's working on purely partisan political matters, he or she. If nothing else, it's sort of a roadmap for that. A calendar is also a roadmap for, to some degree, to the extent of one's access to lobbyists and other representatives of special interest groups. Even if you can't see, for example, exactly when they meet, where they met, and how much time they spent and what they talked about, you can draw some inferences about what the chief executive of a state is doing during the many blocks of time that are not described in any way at all. And then you can, if you have certain suspicions, you can usually confirm them by finding out something about the other person you suspect was at the meeting. Or if it were multiple people, then there are that many more sources. So it's just a calendar is just potentially one set of data, which can be useful in itself, and it also can be particularly useful when confirmed on the basis of other information that is available.
What do you think, Matt? Are these fair comments regarding the potential value of these schedules, and are those of us who seek them onto something?
Well, onto something from the standpoint of there's a big secret that all us governors' offices have that we're hoping you don't find. No, but it is an important piece of the puzzle, and especially during the time when the legislature's in session, which for us is not all the time. It differs from state to state. But that's when I'll get the most questions about the governor's schedule. And you know, has he met with the Speaker of the House this morning? Has he? And we'll always tell them if a meeting has occurred. We won't necessarily say everything that was said in that meeting, of course, but we'll release whether or not the meeting occurred or will occur in the near future. When Andy was putting together the documents for this session, he, of course, and I think it's in the pamphlet, he refers to Governor Sanford in South Carolina and the famous trips to Argentina. And when that story first broke, the Associated Press in New York put out word to all their state bureaus, "Where's your governor right now? Find out." And so they called, and we were incredibly lucky because ours was at the dentist, which was about the most benign, boring, non-political place you could be. But that part is important. If you call your governor's office and say, "Where's your governor right now?" you should be able to get an answer to that question, and that's one we're generally happy to provide.
You know, when I was first asking our State House correspondent Chatterton about the governor's lack of putting out a schedule, he says, "Well, you know, we can call and find out." But you shouldn't have to be a State House reporter with a connection to the governor's office or the governor's spokesperson to be able to find that out. And that's what it comes down to. And I don't, you know, because the general public's not going to call you and say, "Where's the governor?" And they don't know how to do that. But anybody should be able to find that out.
Questions?
Hi, Megan Ryan with the Virginia Coalition for Open Government, and I just wanted to share an experience that we had in Virginia 4 years ago. And it goes to why Jeri is interested in what her governor is doing, and then also something that you referred to, Matt. And that was, at the time, Tim Kaine was the governor of Virginia, and he was also the head of the Democratic National Committee the time that Obama was running for president the first time. And they asked, state Republicans asked for Governor Kaine's schedule, and because they wanted to find out how much time he was spending traveling, when he was going out of state, how much time was he spending doing DNC business and how much time was he doing economic development or legitimate work outside the state of Virginia. I'm sorry, the Commonwealth. He didn't give it to him because he cited the exemption, the working papers exemption, which was a legitimate use of that. It's been stretched, but it was a legitimate exercise of that exemption. And what I loved was that the Associated Press said, okay, well, you're not going to give us the schedule. We're going to go to the state police and we're going to ask them for their security detail. And they have to write down everything that they have done to give protection to the governor. And that showed a lot of travel and a lot by doing cross-references with things that they knew after the fact, the news stories that they could then go back and cross-reference. And they were able to determine how much travel he was doing on behalf of on DNC business. And in my opinion, it came back and it made him look bad because he wouldn't give it up. He comes out, and even if it wasn't any really bombshell information, it just made him look bad because he resisted that. I also just was messing around on my iPad here, and I see that the current governor, Bob McDonald, who I do not have many nice things to say about in terms of transparency in Virginia, one of the things he does do is he does put his calendar on his website.
He's like the gold standard in our survey because he puts out a comprehensive schedule that shows closed meetings and whatnot, and his PAC puts out a political schedule every week on his travels and whatnot.
And we have a very private governor, but he does put out, his press office puts out an enormous number of announcements about where he's going to be or where he's been at the same time. So Matt, if I could ask you to just clarify a little bit, it sounds like you put out a lot of information, but if I understand right, he's not actually required to. And I guess what I'd like to push the panel a little bit further on here is to get each of you to say what really is a fair law or requirement for a governor on this. What really should we be asking them to do, not just counting on them for goodwill? And to press you even further, I think it's one thing to say, let's get the calendar, but it's another thing to say, what should we require to be on the calendars? And so I'm going to press you into that zone a little bit further to try to give us some guidance on what you think the best way to go would be and what should be required, rather than just relying on the goodwill of the occasional governor who really is kind of open.
Well, I think part of it is that even though the law gives a broad exemption to the governor's office, of course, there's a very limited amount of activity that the governor's office can do by itself. And chances are, if there's documents, if there's, occurrences that you're trying to get through the governor's office, you can get them through other parts of state government. It's, of course, not as convenient, but if someone calls me and it's something that we wouldn't necessarily release, I will proactively, but this goes to your goodwill point, I will proactively say, well, why don't you call the Department of Human Services? They have that report. In fact, when we first took office, as one of the last acts of his previous administration, Governor Huckabee took a report about a employee at a state agency who was an ally of his and did the type of very abuse that everyone worries about, and said, well, give us that report. The governor's office will be the custodian of that report, and then we will not have to release it because we have the exemption under the Freedom of Information Act. Governor Beebe's second day in office, he ordered it returned to the original agency. It was immediately FOI'd, and the story came out accordingly. It's on what you request on a schedule, what all needs to be on that schedule. We're careful about being as detailed as we can when we put it out. I also have the luxury of someone who's never running for anything again, so we no longer have any political concerns, or what few political meetings we have are about other people's campaigns. But I guess it's whatever the public feels they need to know about the governor. I mean, at what point? Of course, reporters will always want as much information as they can get on any subject. I was a television reporter for 6.5 years. Obviously, not as much time to be in as much detail as print reporters, but I mean, I know where a lot of it comes from, and I feel a lot of your same frustrations when we're, as I've been sitting through the meetings today. In fact, I was thinking earlier, I was kind of glad we didn't go immediately after the big discussion about catch and release, because I mean I could feel the frustration in the room, and Lucy's up here going that hey, you can take action on this and we can throw all the bums out of office. And now from the Arkansas Governor's office, here's so I feel a lot of the frustration, and I've talked to many frustrated reporters over time and try to help them as much as I can. And I guess it's to the point of if enough people feel that it needs to be more than it is, then that's the power of the people, is to change the law or to convince our legislators to change the law.
I'm prepared to go a little bit farther than that, quite a bit farther. I think, categorically, I can think of very few meetings that a governor of a state would have that shouldn't be, whose existence, the very fact that they happened, should be hidden from the public. That isn't to say necessarily that the law should require disclosure of all that transpired within that meeting. It might, I can even see arguments that in some contexts the very subject of the meeting might also be withheld. But the mere fact that a meeting takes place and who the participants are, including your political enemies, including representatives of various interest groups. There are lots of reasons, of course, why a governor would not particularly want to broadcast that he was meeting with this special interest group or that special interest group. To me, I understand that. That's hardly legal justification for keeping it a secret. If we believe in basic transparency in government, that's exactly the kind of information that should be generally available. And we do require that some of it be made available in other ways, including the discussion we just had before this one. In the case of lobbyists, registered lobbyists, when they do certain things and make contributions, and when they meet with certain people, that often is disclosed. It might vary from state to state, but there is some disclosure usually. I just can't really think of any particular piece of information about simply who the governor may be talking to and meeting with that would ever have to be disclosed. Maybe once or twice in 10 years for national security reasons, and that's probably it.
I agree. I mean, obviously, I don't need her personal calendar, what she's doing, when after hours. But I think, she's elected by the taxpayers. She's paid by the taxpayers. I think we have a right to know what they're doing when they're in the office, when they're on vacation, when they're out of state. A very basic question.
One thing I could add to that answer, I guess, is as we've sought Governor Walker's calendars with the help of Krista Westerberg, who does some great legal work for us at the Investigative Center, we pushed back on a few issues regarding the governor's response to our open records requests. And in particular, there was an issue regarding the redaction of some appointments involving meetings that the governor was holding with CEOs of companies that supposedly were thinking about locating to Wisconsin or expanding here or whatever. I can see a reason to at least temporarily withhold some of that info. I don't particularly like it, but I can see a rationale there, so long as eventually we do learn the identities of those CEOs who were meeting with the governor. One thing I would just note too, from a practical standpoint, we were really surprised to see the Governor Walker's calendars are not in any sort of official state database. In fact, it's a collection of Google calendars. Access to them is gained by various state employees through their private Google accounts. And one thing they insisted on redacting was the private email addresses of the people who controlled those calendars, which that whole system seemed odd, and the whole thing raised some questions about sort of the architecture of the technology underlying these information systems.
Keith Elkins with the Freedom of Information Foundation of Texas. Our governor obviously was running for president recently, and a lot of the national press realized that when they tried to get his copies of his schedules, all they got was blank sheets of paper. And his argument has been, and continues to be to this day, that he works 24/7 for the people of Texas. He doesn't need to put anything on his calendar. They know he's working for them, and don't even bother going to the DPS to get his travel records to see what they are doing, because he has successfully gotten the legislature to block release of those, saying that it is a threat to his personal security. Your thought about that?
My thought is, wow.
That's our thought too.
Yeah, you're saying even after the trip has occurred, after the trips have occurred, you can't get access to any sort of travel records to figure out what cities he went to, what counties he went to.
With the last legislative session, they passed a bill that any travel the governor takes, you cannot get his travel records from the Department of Public Safety to see what they got reimbursed for 18 months after the travel.
18
months. That's going to put us way past the presidential election. Since then, the Texas Supreme Court has ruled that the records are not available at all.
Wow.
So any travel related to the governor, those records are sealed.
Well, I think, you know, the issue of when do the records become available is a significant one. Here in Wisconsin, we have very limited access in advance to the governor's schedule. Bill, you would know better than I am, better than I do, but it's like usually 1 or 2 days in advance. News organizations can get some access to the governor's schedule, correct, in many cases?
He doesn't put out information about where he's going to be more than a day in advance.
Mm-hmm.
He doesn't want a bunch of protests.
Right, right. So the information, the advance info is extremely limited. But we do, you know, tend to enjoy pretty good access to that official calendar, like a month or so after the events occurred. Now the question of, well, what went into the calendar, that's a big one here, and we certainly saw over time more and more stuff being classified as personal, so we don't have a complete grasp of what's in that. That's sort of the black hole category.
Keith's point about the law being passed in this past legislative session and all the discussion going on earlier today about FOI erosion. I wanted to say this at the time, but we ran out of time. Just as a positive note, we've seen in Arkansas with term limits for our legislators that the media institutional knowledge has gotten much deeper than the legislative institutional knowledge, because they turn over so quick, and we've got, you know, we've got a lot of young people, but we've got a lot of old dogs that have been there a very long time and know what they are doing, and they're very, very good during our legislative sessions at still convincing these new legislators that they should come to the Press Association's FOI coalition and kind of present their bill ahead of time and get their blessing on it, because hey, if we, you know, you'll do great. And I've seen legislators go in, because I'll sit in on some of these meetings, and just walk in, just, hey, this is what we're doing, it's just a little old bill, you know, it doesn't really do anything, and they walk out with their tail between their legs after getting a 20-minute tongue lashing from various members of the media. And it's very cathartic, I think, for some of the media people in the room, I will admit. But I do, on a positive end, want to say that at least in our state, that the press still has a very strong voice in fighting FOI erosion, and while we haven't made any significant advances in recent years, we also have had very little backslide.
Orville Seymour, CRG Network, right here in Wisconsin. And my question is for Andy. I'm just curious if you had any difficulty at all getting Governor Walker's calendars or access to them. I just happen to know his scheduler, Dorothy Moore, and she's told me way back when she was in the county exec's office that he keeps 3 calendars. I mean, one public calendar, one private calendar, and one personal calendar for family time. I don't know how in the world they keep all those things without getting overlap, but somehow they manage, and I'm just kind of curious about how you went about that.
The logistics of the open records request, you know, as these things go, it didn't go too badly, I would say. You know, as I mentioned before, there were some redactions which we've challenged and questioned. There were some entire appointments just simply labeled redacted, so we have no clue what, you know, whether there's a grounds to challenge those redactions. We've been assured that those are just things like haircuts and family meetings and things, but why wouldn't that have gone into the private or the personal calendar? So I think, you know, from our standpoint, one of the biggest challenges is that this stuff was not turned over in the form of a database. The Google calendars were printed out, then there were magic markers applied to black things out, and then we got it back, you know, in a scanned PDF, but you couldn't use optical character recognition to do anything with it, so we had to type everything, which took probably 200 hours of staff time to do that and to code it, to turn it into usable categories, you know, to look at which issues the governor was working on, or which legislators he met with, or which media he met with, or campaign contributors and so forth. So it's a big job, and it's the amount of work is greatly increased by the fact that when you do receive the info, it's not in usable electronic form.
We were also thinking that you all might want to discuss a little bit with us a closely related category of information, and that is email communications of the governor. Can you hear me? Yeah. I think the access to these varies quite a bit from state to state. But I think under most state FOI laws, there's no absolute categorical exemption merely because the governor is involved. All sorts of exemptions may be invoked for particular messages based on what is being said. But if we're talking about emails that have to do with public business, they're at least in principle, under most state laws, requestable. And in California, so far as I know, most requests are denied, or let me put it this way: when the information when they're granted, the emails that end up being produced are pretty benign, anodyne kinds of documents, and that's because the governor in California, and I think most governors across the country probably figured this out, that if they want to use email to communicate, and of course they do in some cases, the best way to do that, the safest or most confidential way to do that, is to communicate using their own personal email accounts, their own Google gmail.com account, for example, rather than any .gov account, because they believe that allows them to argue that the email, that the resulting communications are not public records. And the answer to that question is a difficult one. Will depend often on the definition of public records in various state laws, but that's an issue that is very much at the forefront right now in California. And well, my own view is not going to surprise you. I think if the subject of the email is the government's business, it doesn't matter what account is used or what computer is used. It ought to be covered by the Public Records Act. On the other hand, I'm also inclined to give the chief of state, the governor of California, quite a bit more leeway in terms of confidentiality in substantive policy discussions than I would any other public official, state or local in the state, because I think a governor does sometimes need to be able to communicate using the same kinds of modern technology tools that everybody else in the state does, and has to be able to do it sometimes confidentially. Otherwise, you force all communications to occur over the phone or face to face, and that just introduces huge inefficiencies in the governor's office.
Cell phones. There was a case in Colorado. No, I don't know exactly when the ruling came down, but the governor there, a reporter at the Denver Post was trying to get his cell phone records. I don't remember exactly what story she was working on and why it was relevant, but she got his official cell phone and realized there were very few calls on there. And she found out that he has a personal cell phone. He used that for the bulk of his state business. He paid his $50 a month for unlimited calls, and that's what he used. And the Denver Post fought this for years, and they lost at the Supreme Court. I mean, even though they agreed that he could redact his private calls, but it was paid for by him, so that's how he can keep a lot of those calls under wraps.
I'd like to go back to something with Peter. Your organization is the only one in the room to have had this experience. You mentioned when that initial release came of Governor Schwarzenegger's schedule, I think you used it as, we got some good stuff. what was good stuff and what subsequent news stories came out, or what subsequent enlightenment was given to the good people of California?
That's a very good question. As I recall, several reporters scouring these documents were able to measure the relative access that different special interest groups had to then Governor Schwarzenegger, and the results were somewhat surprising, or they were contrary to what the conventional wisdom would have been. That he was meeting quite a bit more often than one would have expected with interest groups who were not normally seen as allied with the governor. Beyond that, I think that there were some decent stories, but I really am, yes, I'm recalling newspaper stories. There were a lot of them at the time, and some I thought that were particularly good because they really took the time to analyze the data and to, in some cases, make calls to other people who were involved in some of these meetings to make sense of them. But did they change the political agenda in the state of California, or dramatically increase transparencies in other areas? No, I can't say that happened, regrettably.
Part of our experience in Minnesota is that you deal with the email issue by filing a retention schedule through your records management statute with a very limited retention period. And the techies push that as a efficiency modality. You don't want to have all those emails sitting around on servers because it clogs the servers and all that, if you'll pardon the expression, bovine excrement. The other thing that was, speaking of chief executives, we had our last governor, a failed presidential candidate, came to the governor's office with a different experience base. He'd been an attorney for local governments and was very knowledgeable about our Data Practices Act, which is what we call our Freedom of Information Act. So when it came to things like email, his response to, "We'd like to look at your emails," was, "I don't use email."
A glimpse here at some of the things we see with Governor Walker. For example, we have 72 counties in Wisconsin. The governor visited about 50 of them over the past the first 13 months in office, according to his calendars, leaving about 20 unvisited while he was in at least 11 other states and spent significant amounts of time in places like the Twin Cities and Chicago. And then you can drill in and you can look at the particular issues that were dealt with in the various counties. If we could tell from the appointments what issues he was there to deal with, or if you want to look at the top issues that he was working on as he made appearances around the state, he's identified jobs as his major one issue. And in fact, we found he spent 100 hours at jobs-related events around the state. And then you can click that and you can see which counties he was in talking about jobs, and on down the list. Where was he talking about vets? Where was he talking about health, children's issues, China? Where did he attend sporting events? Things like that. And then you can also see with his media availability how much of the time he was spending with national media versus Wisconsin media. And then you can break it out and see individual news organizations and individual journalists that he was spending time with, and more time with Fox News than any other organization, about 3 times as much with Fox as with the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel, for example. So those are some of the insights you can glean. They're tips for reporting, and all of this information can be put out to the public and made accessible. It's downloadable. It's transparent. All the individual appointments are available that way. It'll be on wisconsinwatch.org. Part 1 starts midnight tonight.
Wanted to bring up 2 success stories, one regarding emails and one regarding cell phone records. Our newspaper, a few years ago, the county was awarding franchises for a new terminal at the airport, and it became very apparent that the airport manager was awarding these based on the pressure the county commissioners were putting on him They were going to their friends or former consultants, campaign managers, etc. And it looked pretty obvious. The State Ethics Commission started an investigation. To try to quantify this, we asked the county for the cell phone records of every county commissioner for their publicly paid cell phones. They initially said no, then they said yes, and they gave us the records, but all of the names had been crossed off with black markers. So for us to go through it, we would have had to call each one of those numbers, which we were prepared to do, but we filed suit. They won at the district court level. We appealed it to the Supreme Court, which ordered the county to release those cell phone records, ruling that they were indeed public records because the cell phones were paid for by the taxpayers. And not only that, the court required the county to pay all of our legal expenses. So that was good. Just in the last couple years, the Reno Gazette-Journal filed a lawsuit against our former governor, Jim Gibbons, who went through a divorce while in office. And it came out actually in the divorce proceedings that he had been using his state email account to have late-night email conversations with two different women who it was suggested in his divorce case he was having affairs with. There were hundreds of these emails. The Reno paper filed a request under our public records law to see these emails. The lower court said no, and they appealed it to the Supreme Court, which again sided with the public, saying these emails, although the governor does not have, they're not necessarily public records, he must detail the general topic of each one of those emails and give that to the newspaper. They also ruled, the court ruled, that not only would apply to the governor, but it would apply to any state entity, that they would have to do the same thing. Well, you know, of course, what the result will be. People will be using their private accounts instead of the government email. But those are two instances where our Supreme Court has actually sided with the people.
I talk about how fortunate I feel about my job. I was just imagining being the aide or the counsel assigned to interpret the general topic of 200 late-night emails between the governor and someone else. I love my job.
There are three things that came up in these discussions, and one wanted to point out sort of the tension between the two different ways that email, email and government off-network communication can go. In the states that you've mentioned, you're saying that, you know, if they're doing it on their own private email accounts or their own private phones, then those records are not subject to disclosure. And the downside of that is that then you can't get these, you know, if he's using his private accounts to do this, to do government business, then that's a problem. In Virginia, the definition is based solely on whether it has to do with the transaction of public business. Therefore, if you're using your private account, if it has to do with public business, it's still a public record. The downside of that is that we can't get those records. You can't see that someone has been having 200 late-night conversations with someone because that's private. That's not the transaction of public business. So I'm not sure which way is the best way, but it's there are the two different the tensions there. Second thing I wanted to mention was about archiving. I bashed Kane earlier. I'd also like to note that the Library of Virginia is undertaking a huge archiving project right now of Governor Kane's email. When he started his term, they actually worked with his chief of staff to put all email communications to go through a particular server. And that server was then transferred to the Library of Virginia, who has systematically been going through it, categorizing it, tagging it, adding metadata to it. They thought they'd be done last year. They're still working on it, but they're gradually releasing information. They just did some on the Virginia Tech shootings. And thirdly, since we've been talking about schedules, I wanted to know if Matt would like to share his schedule at Improv Little Rock next week.
Wow, a chance for a free plug. I appreciate that. That's very available, but that doesn't involve public money. But to your point about about transaction versus funding, I think from what I've heard, I know it is in Arkansas and from other states I've talked to, a lot of those laws were set up with the idea of follow the money, and wherever public money is being expended, that's where we need to track what's going on. Well, just in the past 2 years, and even less than that, the fact that I've gone from having a phone in my pocket to having a computer in my pocket. And I rarely use my state-issued phone because it's a pain to carry around 2 phones, and all the reporters have my personal number, and they can all reach me as they need me. But if I wanted to now, I could do so much of my business on just my regular phone that I pay $100 a month for, just because of the rapidness of advance in technology. And I think a lot of the laws, while being very well-intended and very effective over the years, have fallen behind where the technology's gone. And also improvlittlerock.com, if any of you are coming through Arkansas.
When is that?
It's a week from tonight, actually.
If I could go real briefly and follow up on something that was said there. I'm Michelle Earl Hubbard. I'm a media law attorney from Seattle, Washington. I'm here this week as a FOIA representative for SPJ. But one of the things when you're dealing with email that I would like to at least offer as a tip that worked in the state of Washington is if a record started out in electronic form under the definitions of public records laws, a lot of the electronic records are themselves public records. And I was actually the lawyer for a case called O'Neill versus City of Shoreline that was the second case in the country. The first was Lake versus Arizona, that declared that metadata itself is a public record when located in a public record. And that case was about an email sent to a deputy mayor at her private email address that she brought up at a city council meeting. Never had the piece of paper, never had the electronic version, but she made it a public record because our definition is owned, used, retained, and prepared. She used it by talking about it. And so when our client asked for that record in electronic form with its metadata intact, she was ordered by the city to produce it to them. She altered it, deleted it, lied about it, gave it to them in some doctored way. It went all the way up to our state Supreme Court, and now it's back. And if they cannot find the original, which is only on some Mac that she had at home that she claims has been burned up or something, they're not in compliance, and they're going to be fined every day until they can somehow figure out what to do. So there is a way to get electronic records, and I would recommend that people ask for records in their native electronic form with its metadata intact. And if you think it resides on somebody's private email, tell the city that they may very well be responsible unless they can get it. Final thing, in Washington State, our governor, who will not be running for office again, has created something that she calls executive privilege. And there's a state before the Washington State Supreme Court called Freedom Foundation versus Gregoire, where she is arguing that in a state where the law says that you have to have an other statute exemption to withhold records, that this made up idea of executive privilege is itself a reason that the governor can remove herself from the reach of a law that was written by the people under the concept of separation of powers. She's argued the courts can't look at the records because that's the judiciary telling the governor what to do, and that the people can't, and the legislature can't, tell the governor that she is covered by the PRA, our public records law. It's a very troubling thing, and we've actually asked NFOIC and some others if they're at all interested to jump in on an amicus brief. There's only a few states in the country that have this broad executive privilege. They have very different laws, and it's a very dangerous concept, and it's based on Nixon, and nothing based on Richard Nixon should ever be allowed to become a reason to have more secrecy. So I urge you to follow that one.
A quick question to follow up on your point about metadata. For those of us who are not necessarily computer literate, what's an example of how the value of a data set is enhanced if you have the metadata?
Metadata is data about data. That's the definition. That's in a bunch of court opinions. But basically, it shows you all kinds of things. So, for example, it shows you who created a document, who edited a document, when it was created. The Lake case was about a Word document where a police officer believed that his boss had created a record after the fact to discipline him. And they needed the metadata so they could prove that. No, this wasn't, in fact, a warning memo. You made this a month later because you wanted to get back at me. And so it's things for authenticating. But it shows that it is really what it was, and it shows who made comments and who edited it. And if they do it right, it actually can show you the BCCs and the CCs and the trail that it takes. And so it's really about the whole original life of a document. But it's mostly for authentication purposes, I think, that reporters want it.
Can I piggyback on a point that both Megan and Peter made? If it's government business, it doesn't matter whether or not it's on a private account. It ought to be an open record. The other side of that same rule, though, is, you know, if the government paid for the electronic device, then damn it, the communications ought to be a public record, even if it's about the late night calls to your girlfriend. Maybe anybody, one more question, and then we'll go to cocktail hour.
I don't really have a question, but I have a good tip for a working journalist, and that is if you know, lots of times you don't know what's going on, you go on a fishing expedition. One really good way to find out what's really going on is to ask for emails that mention you, because you'll find all kinds of emails. Don't tell Deb Groover this, or we're worried that Deb Groover knows about this. You have to have thick skin because of all the other things they may say about you, but I've gotten some great stories that way.
My name is Dale Wetzel. I'm with the Associated Press. I'd take that a step further. I ask for emails randomly, you know, a week's worth of email from the governor's office and see what they've got going on. And I do this with state agencies too. And you do it at random and just go and pop them and say, I want your email for a week or even 3 or 4 days. And I don't ask them if they mention me or not, but maybe I should.
All right, let's have a big hand for this panel, please.